All right. I think I'm live. I don't know. I never know. It's never quite clear when we're live. I hope the audio and everything is working. I've been having audio issues with my setup. Nonetheless, here we are. Welcome to another edition of Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel. And I today don't have a lot going on, so I figured I might take you on a tour of the K22 system and teach you how to play it, which is something that's actually pretty popular. A lot of people want to know what is the system and how does it work. This podcast will cover all of that. Now, we've had a quiet weekend, although we were expecting a very busy weekend. This is the weekend of the Armchair Generals Digital Convention. The convention didn't get much turnout, so we were supposed to be running Kriegsspiels now, and I was going to do the show and cover one of the battles, but it just didn't happen. This is also last week, last Sunday, we did a rainbow battle, which is the rainbow tournament, which is sort of a competitive Kriegsspiel tournament. Very happy to say I actually won, whatever that means. I won, right? But it was a really good time. Anyway, that's just kind of what's going on in the International Kriegsspiel Society. I know in 1 week, I think we have our big Christmas coup battle, which is highly anticipated. And there's a couple of other events that are kind of coming to a head in the next week or two in the International Kriegsspiel community. So make sure that you join the IKS and join the Discord and get involved because there's some fun opportunities. All right, let's talk about the K22 system, and let's see if I want a different map here. Let's pull up map 1. It's a big map, and it covers all my stuff. Let's try that. There we go. Map 3 is pretty nice. All right, so in the K22 system, I've created a bunch of pieces, and the blocks are half battalion blocks. Here's your cavalry units. I need to create cuirassier, or however you pronounce it, blocks for it. We have our batteries, we have our skirmish blocks, and we have our supply trains. Again, all pretty standard stuff for Kriegsspiel. My friend Damon has actually created some really cool blocks that preserve fog of war when sending screenshots to players. These blocks allow you to input values on the back end to track different things. You can track ammo, morale, manpower, whatever it is that you want to track. You can actually just use the numbers however you want. So you don't have to track what's on the label, obviously. You just have to use your brain, track whatever you want. Hello to Achilles, and hello to Plato, who is in the Discord channel. So hello to both of you. Good to see you. And I hope you enjoy this podcast. All right, so let's talk about how this system works, right? Okay, the system, and I have basically sort of a cheat sheet here for the rules. The turns are 5 minutes. In original Kriegsspiel, it's 2 minutes. We've been playing in the IKS with a 15-minute turn cycle, or cadence as I call it, and 5 minutes is what I want to be using. Each square is 400 paces. This gets us much closer to the original Kriegsspiel. The IKS standard, of course, square is 400 paces. The infantry artillery moves a square per 5 minutes. The cavalry moves 1.5 or 2 squares at the gallop, but they can't gallop forever. But they obviously move faster. I then have the combat resolution here, and then I have what the results mean, and so on. I have what's called the assault column, which would also probably be the same more or less as mixed order for the French if they were to use that formation. Again, I would probably use some things or some derivative of this. And that's what it means to be a master umpire, by the way. It means the rules are actually more of guidelines. So if something comes up in a game that doesn't quite fit in the rules, you have to use your brain and use some logic and say, okay, I'm going to handle it this way. And usually it's not that crazy of a resolution process. Usually it's pick the correct die to roll the die, and you're going to apply a die roll modifier one way or the other, and that's it. So even if you encounter a pretty exotic situation that you don't expect to counter that's not covered in the rules, you just kind of figure it out. You work it out, and that's what it means to be a master umpire. That's what a master umpire does. So that's how that works. So everything is really subject to your judgment and discretion as an umpire. You can even arbitrarily make changes to results, because Kriegsspiel is not a game in the traditional sense where the purpose is to master the rules and beat every other player because you know the rules better than other players. That's how most games work. Most games kind of have this mathematical formula, if you will. And if you study the game long enough, you know that, a certain blend of cards in my hand that I cycle through will create a victory point generating machine, and I'll win the game. Or maybe you figure out that a certain order of moving pieces creates momentum, and then your opponent cannot stop that. That's how most board games work. They're these mathematical algorithms, and when you kind of crack it, which your brain will naturally do just by playing the game by experience. Um, you can then manipulate that, and a person who's played a game, 10 times has a tremendous advantage over a person who's playing it only for the first or second time. Not the case with Kriegsspiel. Again, everybody's obsessed with rule sets in Kriegsspiel. They even ask me, what rule set do you use? We don't. We use guidelines essentially. So we do have written rules, but the rules are guidelines. Now, I would say if there's a written rule, don't depart from it unless you have a pretty good reason to do so, a justifiable reason. But otherwise, follow the rules. The rules kind of make it easy for you, and they do all the thinking is done for you. So follow the rules when playing. But if you encounter a strange situation, then feel free to depart from them a little bit and resolve the situation in a manner that's reasonable. Okay, let's take a look here. The heart of the system is the dice and what's called combat value on the pieces. So let's start with combat value. These pieces have what's called a combat value. A reduced size block loses 1 point of combat value. Blocks start at 5 by default, but if you want to run with like a militia quality unit, its combat value would be 4. If you want to go with an elite quality unit, its combat value would be 6. In order to vary the combat values of the units, rather than having everybody pushing the same 4 block 20-point combat value brigade into each other, I have come up with a point system where I have players usually randomly pull a chit, or I'll give them points, and then they can build their formations off these points. Base block is 5. Base cavalry block hussars are 5. Let's see, lancers I think are 5. The cuirassiers I think are 6. And the other one that I have to create is the carbiner block. This is my cuirassier block, by the way. I said I had to create it. No, I have it here. The carbiner block needs to be created, or a dragoon block. But they all have values. Each battery is 5 points. You can even see the number 5 that I put on there because these are pieces I carried over where I did have the point values printed on the pieces. I removed that to avoid players doing calculations. And then you have here, I have light infantry blocks. And this here actually represents a light infantry company. It's technically embedded inside the battalion, but I have them on the map to remind me that this particular battalion, which would be this here, battalion is 2 blocks, 450 men with a light company in there. It's a +1 die roll modifier, is the light company, okay? So you total up the combat value between a couple of forces that are engaging each other, and then you decide what die to roll. So let's go ahead and put some blocks out here and see. Let's create a little mini hypothetical skirmish right here, okay? So red is here, and let's turn them around like this so they're facing the right way. Doesn't have to be exact. It's Kriegsspiel. Kriegsspiel, my friends, is the land of fudge. Alright, so we've got those blocks there, and those 2 blocks are going to be hitting a pair of blue blocks. And I'm going to take these blocks over here. Okay, great question. What are some of the most unusual situations you've encountered that you've had to make non-standard rules for? Actually, it happens more often than you think. Generally for me with cavalry engagement, especially Napoleonic cavalry, because there's a lot of variation in Napoleonic cavalry, and they're all kind of different. And I even have this joke that, even when you're right, you're wrong, because somebody will argue with you over the power and the nature of the unit and so on. So I've had to do this all the time. In fact, up until recently, maybe the past couple weeks, I didn't even have really good cavalry rules. I had to come up with a whole chart and everything to figure out how I wanted to work cavalry rules. The heart of the K22 system is you pick one die, you roll it, and you're done. Whereas with the cavalry, I found that it doesn't work that way because the units are so different from each other. For example, lancers are quite different from hussars. And when they run into each other, hey, lancers have an initial advantage, don't they? They've got those long lances, they can spear you. However, once you get into close combat, the situation changes, and now the hussars, who are more experienced with their sabers, would arguably have a better advantage over you. What do you do when how do you resolve that? You can't resolve that with just one die roll like you can with infantry exchanging volleys. So what I had to do is come up with a chart and do two die rolls. One die roll for the lancers, and then the next die roll is for the other unit that's coming in. So in this case, if you take a look at let's see, dragoons against lancers, dragoons roll first with a +1 to their die roll. Then I roll a second die, and the lancers get a +2 to that die. And the reason is, as the lancers close in on the dragoons, assuming the dragoons are dismounted, now that's not indicated on here, but we're assuming that the dragoons are dismounted in this particular scenario. And if that's the case, then we start with giving the dragoons a +1 here to the die roll. I don't have a pin that I can write with on here, do I? All right, we give the dragoons a +1 with the die roll. We roll the die a second time, and then we give the lancers a +2, and we apply both effects. And that makes some sense because cavalry versus cavalry combat is pretty traumatic. It's pretty rough on both sides. So anytime cavalry blocks smash into each other, it's pretty destructive for both sides. But yeah, that's one of those situations. In fact, this whole system is is you know, we've put it together based on our years of experience with Kriegsspiel. Dylan also asks, are there a lot of cav-on-cav engagements? How do you encourage players to avoid that as it is more historical? Organically, you limit, you put a price on the cavalry blocks, and then you limit, you could limit the number of cavalry blocks they can have, but I don't always. If you look at certain historical engagements or certain periods in history, at some points in history, cavalry was the dominant force on the field, and you would see a lot of cavalry and a lot of cav-on-cav engagements. So you kind of do it organically, but if you want to limit it, you can limit it. You just tell the players, for this scenario, you're only allowed 1 or 2 cav blocks or whatever. And again, I also vary the cost. So you can get an infantry block for 5 points, but this block costs 7. So actually 6. So 5 points or 6 points. And since you have a round number of points, the opportunity cost of getting a 6-point block is kind of high. Because now you're forced to buy 3 or 4 other 6-point blocks to round it out. Otherwise, now you're throwing away points. So you have to make tough choices. So players don't go too crazy on the cavalry unless they want an all cavalry force. I've also, in my game, I told them, a game that I'm running now under this system, I told the players, you can either run cavalry or you can run infantry. You may not run both. So players had to either do an infantry build with no cavalry or a cavalry build with no infantry. And the only people I gave an exception to were the commanders-in-chief, because those units are technically reserves. But anyway, getting back to this. Okay, so now I have these two forces here, right? Now, let's say these are all standard blocks. 5 plus 5 is 10. 5 plus 5 is 10. So 10 versus 10, that's the combat value of both units. Now that means I roll the even money die, which is the white one. And I call it even money. It's really equals CV. And it's actually printed on the die. Let me go back to rotation of 1. On the first side of every die, I have it printed. Equal combat value die. If the sides are within 1 combat value point of each other, and it's infantry versus infantry, I roll this die. Okay, so now let's roll the die and see what happens. Okay, inferior falls back. Oh, yes, I forgot to calculate which side is superior and which side is inferior. Usually there's a variation in combat value. One side has more combat value points than the other. That side is the superior side, the other side is the inferior side. If the combat value between the two blocks is equal, the umpire may, at their discretion, designate one side as superior and the other side as inferior. In this case, I'm going to call superior red because they have light infantry. So I'm just going to say they're superior. That's going to give them a marginal edge in the combat. The designation superior and inferior doesn't do anything to the dice themselves. It doesn't impact your odds of a favorable outcome to be declared inferior. All it does is it designates which result on the die applies to you and which result applies to your opponent. Now, remember what I said about light infantry? Red has light infantry, so they get a +1 die roll modifier. Since they're superior, higher number results are the superior favorable results. Lower number results favor inferior. So in this case, they're going to get a +1 to the die roll modifier. We rotate it to the 7. And now the inferior retreats. Now what does that mean? They retreat. Okay? What does it mean when they retreat? Well, retreat means they back up a certain distance. Let's take a look at the chart. Okay? Retreat is 400 paces. They take 1 disruption marker and they suffer no loss. So this doesn't mean that they magically avoided casualties. What it means is that they did not suffer so many losses that it degraded the unit on a permanent basis. But they did suffer some losses. So now that they have, they get a disruption. And a disruption is a -1 die roll modifier. I need to make a special marker for that. I haven't done that yet. But they've come back to 400 paces. Let's get a marker, disruption marker, and put it on one of the blocks. It does not apply to the whole battalion. All effects apply to only one block in the entire stack that's fighting. And unless you're doing melee, if you're doing melee, which one side or the other has to declare we're going to charge in with the bayonet, then all units on both sides will take losses. Okay, let's take a look for a second here at another version of this engagement now. Let's take a look at the advantage die, as I call it. Let's say red has an advantage. Let's say red is 2 regular blocks 5 and 5. We'll take the light infantry away for the moment because that's a needless complication. And let's say these 2 French blocks are militia blocks, 4 and 4. Okay, so now I have 10 versus 8. Well, let's take a look at what the advantage die does. The advantage die is the other infantry die, and when the one side has greater than or equal to combat value points of the opponent, then the superior side gets this die. So the British, being superior in this case, having 10 points, gets a die over the French, which is 8 points. And the die simply has slightly more favorable results for the superior side. Let's go ahead and roll it and see what happens to the French. Oop. Okay, hang on there. Tabletop Simulator being weird. Here we go. Okay, and it says here the inferior retreats. Again, retreat is 400 paces. Take a disruption. Okay, they could rout, which is 800 paces, and they take a routed marker. Things like that. Okay, let's see another one. Would you roll the same dice for 1 versus 1 or 2 versus 2? Wouldn't that mean half the casualties disruption when in larger form? The answer is yes, you do. So even if I have 8 blocks, I roll the same dice. But no, I do not apply. Hang on. Let's see here. Let's move these guys. So here's 4 blocks on 4 blocks, but no, I don't apply it to like so many blocks or anything. Just 1 block gets it. The reason is I think it makes the combat almost historically bloody, like too bloody. The casualties become too great. I think just as we run most Kriegsspiels, the worst penalty that happens is usually you back up. Blocks are rarely destroyed in Kriegsspiel. They can be reduced, and these do have reduced states. and they can take hits. They can take hits. If they get routed, they do take a hit, and they do reduce in size. But that's kind of uncommon, and that's because, generally speaking, the units would just push the rear ranks forward to fill out the front ranks, and that's what these blocks represent. So if so many men in a unit have been killed or injured that the unit can no longer occupy its typical frontage, then like I think it's like 125, 150 paces, it varies, then the block would become smaller. But if I were doing that to every one of these, the system would break down very quickly. The Kriegsspiel would end very quickly. And it's enough to just push them and back them up. If you look at historical battles, the casualties that they suffered were not nearly as high as people assume. I know you see these dramatic movies like The Patriot or whatever, and Glory and whatever, and these men fire at each other, and all the guys in the front rank fall over dead. That's actually not necessarily realistic. It is very dramatic, but in reality, this type of combat produced remarkably few casualties, except in those really big, really famous battles where both sides were really contending for victory, and they kind of went all in the battle. You look at a battle like Waterloo, some of these other big engagements, I think Austerlitz, I think Borodino or whatever, these very famous battles that every war gamer knows. And the reason those battles are famous is because they were bloody, and they were bloody because they were practically fights to the death between the two generals. But most engagements were much smaller than that, and they ended very quickly, and many were never really even recorded in the history books, hardly. There might be just a little note that, hey, the skirmishers fought here and whatever. And that's really what this system encapsulates. Now, we could do a Waterloo scale battle. I've never seen anyone actually do it. The system is too fine to do a Waterloo scale battle. It's 5 minutes. You don't want to play Waterloo in 5-minute increments. You can play it in 15 or 10-minute increments, perhaps, certainly 15 or 20-minute increments. You don't want to play it in 5-minute increments, though. It's too unwieldy. And again, that exceeds the purpose of the exercise of Kriegsspiel, which is a training exercise for officers. Do I play any American Revolutionary War battles? We have not really. I did do an ARW Kriegsspiel that somebody else hosted, and it was kind of like a blend of Kriegsspiel and miniatures. Um, and there is demand for American Revolutionary War system or battles in the IKS, and this system can absolutely be adapted for that purpose. Probably needs very little tweaking to do it. What's going to be hard is when I tweak this for the American Civil War, which I'm actually looking forward to doing, because I know that much better than the Napoleonic. But no, we have not done any American Revolutionary War. We have done many 7 Years' War. But we recognize that that's kind of something we want to move into, and we will be moving into it in time. Yes, we are going to be doing them, even though we haven't done any yet. All right, let's take a look. Artillery, and I'm starting to run out of time on the podcast here. But if I give one side artillery, that artillery can then fire infantry support. The artillery is a +1 die roll modifier. And I would roll just the infantry die. In this case, let's say the two forces are even, right? Okay. I've got 20 points versus 20 points plus an artillery. The points of the battery do not contribute to the combat value. It's just a +1 to the die roll in this case. So I'm going to roll the even money die, as I call it, and I'm going to give blue a +1. And 6, and the inferior falls back. Now, fall back is different from retreat. Fall back is they back up 200 paces, and they just kind of hold. They don't suffer any ill effects. It's an orderly backup is what they've done. They've backed up while in good order. That's fall back. Okay. Of course, what you don't want is you don't want a rout. If you get a rout, one of your blocks is taking a loss. You don't want to get routed, and you're going back 800 paces, and you're going out of formation. You're going to be in a column like this. You're going to be running away, basically. It's a mass of men running away. And you don't want that, and it takes time to get these units back to combat effective state. Again, let's take a look at the dice now, because that's really the heart of the system. Let's see here. We've talked about the infantry dice. Let's take a look at the artillery dice real quick. Oh, by the way, this is the melee die. And again, all units take hit in the melee. If superior is more powerful than the inferior in terms of combat value, by 2 or more, apply a +2 die roll modifier to this. So if the two units were to clash, let's say we have French elite versus British regulars, and they are all in a melee, well, in that case, then the French would get a +2 to the die roll, because their combat value is 4 points greater than the British. And if this is the die roll here, 4, now I'm going to rotate it +2, inferior falls back, but they all take hits on both sides. So it's a pretty expensive thing to do, and you probably don't want to do it because you're going to decimate your units very quickly. Again, historical. So, okay, and then both fall back. So we didn't even get a decisive result on that one. So probably not something you want to do very often. I wanted to make melee difficult and expensive because otherwise players were doing a lot of melee combat, which is a little bit inappropriate. So talk about inappropriate. We got one of those comments here. Let's see. Report that as spam. There we go. All right, that'll go away. Okay, let's continue. Artillery. We have here what's called the unopposed artillery block. If I have artillery firing on infantry and the infantry are not in range to shoot back, they're just, hey, you know, maybe for example this infantry is on the road here and they're marching along here and I have a battery over here that's firing on them. I'm going to roll the unopposed artillery die. Okay, roll it. And the defender, ooh, I need to change the letters on this. But the defender routes, and the defender is hit. So this artillery fire was sufficiently powerful that it routed these blocks, and one of them took a hit. So let's see here. We would apply a hit to one. We'll just say this lead unit gets hit. Okay, and then we route the units. And that's 800 paces. They're going to move away. Basically, the men are just running away. We're going to put sorry, my audio cut out. There we go. Known issue. Okay, that's what happens there. The other scenario is when artillery is fighting other artillery. Now, if the artillery is fighting with infantry, it's acting in support and it just adds a +1 die roll modifier to the result. If both sides have the same thing going on, they cancel each other out. But let's take a look here at a curious situation. Let's say these two batteries are engaged in a counter battery duel. So I'm going to roll one for blue, and it's a miss. Now I'm going to roll one for red, and that's a hit. So they lose one of their guns. Technically, this represents 6 guns. I think they're 300, or I can't remember what they were. But 6 guns hub to hub, and I keep wanting to say 300 feet apart, but I don't think that's right at all. That sounds bizarre. What was it? Oh, I have it memorized, but I'm drawing a blank on it. But anyway, in any case, this unit we get a hit marker. And for every hit marker on the unit, it's a -1 die roll modifier to that unit. So that's really bad. You don't want that. You don't want that -1 DRM because it becomes very hard to hit things. And that's because you're not shooting, not putting a lot of fire out. There's only hits on side 6, 7, and 8. Side 8 is a hit and a retreat or a rout. The unit runs away. But otherwise, all the other sides are blank. And the reason is players love counter battery fire. And there's no reason for that. It's not as accurate as players assume. So the idea is we don't want them doing a lot of counter battery fire, so you make sure the odds of scoring hits are low, as they would have been historically, because you really want them to use artillery historically, and that is as you want to fire on the key element in the enemy force, which is usually going to be their infantry. Now the cavalry dice. There are 3 cavalry dice because that's how varied cavalry are. Uh, I have uh, I have here. Well, let's set them all to 1 real quick. Rotation value 1. This is cavalry versus cavalry. So anytime, I'm sorry, this is cavalry versus cavalry. This one here. Anytime you have 2 cavalry units clashing with each other, you roll this die, and you see the chart for the die modifiers and the rules. So let's just pick 2 cavalry units. Let's take Lancers, and let's go up against Cuirassiers. And I'm probably mispronouncing it, but whatever. Right here, Lancers versus Cuirassiers. Okay, so they go in. They're going to fight each other, right? Let's take a look at the chart. Lancers versus Cuirassiers. Okay, the Lancers get a +1 initially, and the Cuirassiers get a +2. Okay, so I'm going to roll the die 2 times. Let's move all this stuff out of the way. Clutter. And there we go. Okay, so roll the die 2 times. First for the Lancers. And they get a +1 to their die roll. And that's pretty powerful. An 8. Inferior destroyed. Now let's roll it for the Cuirassiers. And let's give them a +2. 8. Wow. In this case, both sides are destroyed. And again, even though it's inferior, it switches with the other side. I need to make that clear in the rules, because I don't think that's written in the rules anywhere. Anyway, both units have basically destroyed each other. What does that mean? Does that mean they all fought to the death? No. What it means is both units fought each other so hard that they are no longer combat effective for the rest of the day. Both units are now out of the battle permanently for the day. Tomorrow, if we're playing in a campaign, the players would probably get those units back in some form. They might be reduced in some form. But today, for the rest of this battle, those 2 units are gone. Okay? Let's say I have cavalry versus infantry. Here's an infantry block. Let's grab a cavalry block. Okay? And actually here we go. Cavalry versus infantry. And the 2 sides are going to fight right here. Okay? Now we pull this out. Okay? When do we roll this die? Let's take a look at the rotation 1 and let's read the rules. Cavalry versus infantry artillery. If it's against a square, a very rare 3 die roll modifier. So if this unit forms square, and we have a marker for that, if it forms a square, then the cavalry are going to have a really hard time. If they do not form a square in time, and the square has to be ordered, they have to give the order in advance. They can't form the square. Once the cavalry charges, they're going to close this distance so fast, the square won't be fully formed when they hit. So when you see cavalry, a lot of players will just immediately say, all right, go into square. Okay? If they don't do that, which sometimes they don't, they hit, and that's a full charge. I'm going in full charge because I'm charging. The cavalry are going to get a +2 die roll modifier. Let's roll it and see. Okay, they get a 3, and then we rotate 2 more to 5, and the infantry retreats. Okay, so they're going to back up 400 paces, and they take a disruption marker. They're lucky they weren't completely wiped out, but that's what happens. Let's say, however, they form a square. Okay, these hussars hit the infantry who are in square. We roll the die. And now the cavalry is destroyed. We don't even have to reduce the combat or the die roll results because we're already at a 1. Cavalry gets wiped out. Again, are they all dead? No. But they are so badly damaged and beat up that they are no longer combat effective for the rest of the day. That's how that works. All right, let's take a look here. The other die is the Dragoon die, and it only comes into use if you have Dragoons versus infantry, because they're a little different. They've got their little muskets, and they're shooting at the infantry. That's kind of an uncommon case, but it does happen, so therefore the die does exist, but it's not typical. All right. All right, well, there you have it. That's how the system works. And believe it or not, with all of that stuff, you just roll 1 die, you resolve the combat, there's a discernible result, apply the effects, and go. The general rule is this: you calculate the combat value of the two sides. You declare one side as the superior or the inferior, even if they're the same. You apply any die roll modifiers after you roll the die, and then that's it. And that's how it goes. So you apply the losses, hits, only apply to one unit per group. And usually the groups aren't that big. So I know there might be some concern. Well, what if I have 8 blocks or 16 blocks versus 16 blocks? Pretty darn rare to see anything more than maybe 4 or blocks or so. Usually you only see about like 4 blocks. So does the infantry not have a closing volley on the cavalry? Yes, they do, and that's factored into the die roll. Um, let's see here. That is factored into the die roll, though. That's in the calculus on the die. Let me take a look here. This is like cavalry. That's cavalry. It's cavalry versus infantry. It's this one. There we go. That's cav versus cav. It is this one. It's the cavalry versus infantry. I had it right the first time. Again, it really comes down to whether or not the infantry is in a square. If they're in a square, it's going to be pretty hard. If they're not in a square, it's going to be pretty easy for the cavalry. Of course, other modifiers apply, right? If the unit's disrupted or something like that, then that's different. Okay, that then has an effect on the die roll. If the unit is in better terrain, let's say here's a great little example of that up here on top of one of these hills. If the unit is right here, if the unit is functionally entrenched or something, well, that's going to be a die roll modifier. In fact, not only is that probably a +1, it's going to be a +2 in favor of the infantry. In fact, the cavalry would probably never charge that position. But if they did, well, that would be a +2, because that's how far an umpire can using their discretion, modify the die roll. But again, it has to be highly justifiable, which in this case it would be. But yeah, cavalry would never charge that. So yeah, there is that effect where the infantry are firing. But again, it's all encapsulated in one die roll, which is what makes the system faster. And if that one die roll is inadequate, if you think one side should have more of an advantage over the other, then you modify the die roll by 1 or 2. And the scenarios where that's prescribed are, let's see, they are listed here: terrain, cover, light infantry, support, and artillery. All of these apply die roll modifiers up to a maximum of 3, although really it should just be 2, but there are scenarios where up to 3 are applied. They're just very rare. Let's see. Jan says dragoons do shoot on the infantry. In what world does that happen? All the time. That's the point of the muskets, folks. All right. Okay, well, hey, everyone. I want to thank you for watching today's episode of Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel. Next week, I think we have our Christmas coup battle on Sunday. We'll be broadcasting that on here, the whole battle, if that's the case. Obviously, I'm a player in that, so you'll be seeing it from my player perspective. And it should be a good time. Well, all right, we ran over by about 8 minutes, but let's go ahead and wrap up. And I just want to say, I will see you on the next adventure.